It's a phone call between two men who despise each other. On one end, Donald Trump, President of the United States, sitting in his Mar-a-Lago estate, an armada of American warships parked off a coastline 600 miles away. On the other end, Nicolas Maduro, the self-declared president of Venezuela, a man the United States government had already indicted, already put a $50 million bounty on, already accused of running one of the largest narco-trafficking operations in the Western Hemisphere. "You gotta surrender," Trump told him. According to Trump's own account of the call, Maduro came close. Close enough that, for a moment, the year 2026 might have started with a quiet exile instead of a war zone. But Maduro didn't surrender. He stayed in Caracas, and in doing that, he sealed the fate of a 27-year-old regime and set the stage for one of the most audacious military operations in modern American history. This is the story of that operation. And more specifically, it's the story of one man inside it, a Chinook helicopter pilot named Eric Slover, who flew directly into a wall of enemy gunfire, took 4 rounds to his leg and hip, and somehow refused to let go of the controls until the mission was done. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what happened in the skies over Caracas on January 3, 2026, and why, less than 2 months later, the President of the United States would place the nation's highest military honor around Eric Slover's neck in the middle of a State of the Union address, while both parties in Congress stood and chanted USA. To understand what happened to Eric Slover, you have to rewind to the fall of 2025. For years, the United States government had accused Nicolas Maduro of something far more serious than authoritarianism. Washington's position was that Maduro wasn't just Venezuela's illegitimate president. He was, according to a federal indictment, the head of a criminal network called the Cartel de los Soles, allegedly using cocaine trafficking to fund his own grip on power. In November 2025, the State Department formally designated that cartel a foreign terrorist organization, lumping it in with Tren de Aragua and the Sinaloa cartel. Then, the pressure campaign began to escalate, fast. Starting in September, U.S. forces began striking speedboats in the Caribbean and the Eastern Pacific that the administration said were smuggling narcotics toward the United States. Boat after boat was hit. By the time the campaign was in full swing, dozens of vessels had been destroyed and well over 100 people killed, according to U.S. officials, though independent experts pushed back on part of the official story, noting that much of the cocaine moving through those waters was likely bound for Europe, not the United States. The administration's own rationale shifted over time, too. Was this about drugs? Or was it about Maduro? At one point, according to an interview later given to Vanity Fair, White House Chief of Staff Susie Wiles said the goal of the strikes was simple: to keep hitting the boats until Maduro cries uncle. And the military buildup around Venezuela wasn't subtle. Through October and November, the Pentagon quietly assembled one of the largest naval deployments in the region in decades. Guided missile destroyers, a nuclear-powered fast-attack submarine, Marines, F-35 fighter jets staged nearby. Then, in mid-November, the true centerpiece arrived, the USS Gerald R. Ford, America's largest and most advanced aircraft carrier, steaming into the Caribbean under an operation the Pentagon named Southern Spear. By the time the Ford was on station, there were something like a dozen U.S. Navy vessels, and more than 15,000 American service members in the region. Maduro didn't back down publicly. He mobilized his own forces, small militia units positioned at hundreds of locations around the country, preparing, according to his government, for prolonged resistance against what he called an act of war. He went on Venezuelan state television and accused Washington of manufacturing a pretext for regime change. Behind the scenes, though, something quieter and far more dangerous was already happening. As early as August 2025, months before any of this became public, a small CIA team had slipped into Venezuela. Their job wasn't sabotage. It was surveillance. According to Dan Rosenkane, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, U.S. intelligence had built up such a detailed picture of Maduro's daily life that they reportedly knew about his pets. They knew where he slept, what he ate, where he traveled and when. Meanwhile, a small circle inside the Trump administration, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, CIA Director John Ratcliffe, and Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller had been meeting privately for months, laying the groundwork for something much bigger than boat strikes. And somewhere in a training facility, American Special Operations Forces began rehearsing an assault on a replica of Maduro's own compound, the same method U.S. forces had used in 2011 to rehearse the raid that killed Osama bin Laden. Troops trained with industrial blowtorches, in case they needed to burn through steel doors to reach a hardened safe room. All of this, the ships, the phone calls, the shadow campaign inside Venezuela's own capital, was building towards something. Nobody outside a small circle of officials knew exactly when. But by the final days of December 2025, the pieces were already in motion. Before we get to what happened on the night of January 3rd, you need to understand who was sitting in the cockpit of the lead helicopter. Because Eric Slover's path to that moment didn't start in 2025. It started 2 decades earlier. Slover enlisted in the United States Army back in August of 2005. Like most soldiers in sensitive special operations roles, very little about his early life or hometown has ever been made public. That secrecy is deliberate, a standard practice to protect operators and their families from retaliation. What is known is that after completing basic training, Slover was selected for Warrant Officer Candidate School, and from there went straight into flight school, where he qualified as a pilot on the CH-47 Chinook. The huge, twin-rotor, heavy-lift helicopter that has hauled American troops and cargo through nearly every major conflict since Vietnam. He would go on to build his academic credentials while serving, earning a Bachelor of Science in Strategic Studies and Defense Analysis through Norwich University's College of Graduate and Continuing Studies, Norwich being the oldest private military college in the United States, founded on the same citizen-soldier philosophy that would come to define Slover's own career, part scholar, part warfighter. His first brush with real danger came early. In November of 2009, Slover, then a Chief Warrant Officer II flying with the 82nd Combat Aviation Brigade, was part of a Chinook crew nicknamed Flipper 76, searching for 2 missing American paratroopers in Badghis Province, Afghanistan. During the operation, as wounded soldiers were being loaded onto his aircraft, the helicopter took a hit from a rocket-propelled grenade. The round tore into the thin-skinned fuselage and lodged there, unexploded, while the crew kept flying, kept evacuating the wounded, completely unaware for a stretch of time that they were carrying a live grenade in the back of the aircraft. It would become one of the largest medical evacuation efforts of the entire Afghan war that day, and Slover would later be awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for his actions. Between deployments, Slover found an unlikely second calling: bodybuilding. Long before most of the country had ever heard his name, he was competing and training in the sport, building the kind of physical discipline that mirrors the same relentlessness the Army had already instilled in him. It's a detail that surprised even people inside that world. After his Medal of Honor was announced, bodybuilding publications and gym culture creators who had crossed paths with him online realized, almost in disbelief, that a fellow lifter they'd once trained alongside or interviewed had quietly become one of the most decorated soldiers in the country. By January of 2026, Slover held the rank of Chief Warrant Officer 5, the most senior warrant officer grade in the Army, and was flying for the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the legendary Night Stalkers, the same secretive unit that flew the helicopters into Abbottabad for the Bin Laden raid. Their motto, Night Stalkers Don't Quit. At 45 years old, with more than 2 decades in uniform, Slover was about to be handed the most important flight of his career. Back to the fall and winter of 2025. The pressure kept building. By late October, Trump was telling 60 Minutes that Maduro's days as Venezuela's leader were numbered. Reporters asked him directly whether the CIA was now authorized to move against Maduro personally, and Trump wouldn't rule it out. Through November and December, the war of nerves between the two men played out partly over the phone and partly in public. At one point, according to reporting later published by the New York Times, the United States quietly offered Maduro an exit ramp, step down, and live out a comfortable exile in Turkey. Maduro turned it down, and then, according to the same New York Times report, something almost absurd tipped the scales. In the weeks before the raid, Maduro kept appearing in public, dancing, not once, but repeatedly, brushing off the American pressure campaign with almost theatrical nonchalance. In one especially strange moment, caught on video and widely shared, Maduro broke into a rendition of John Lennon's Imagine in front of a crowd, framing it as a call for peace. In another, weeks later, after the U.S. had struck a dock it said was being used for drug trafficking, Maduro was back on Venezuelan state television, bouncing along to an electronic beat, while a recorded voice looped the phrase, "No crazy war," in English. According to The Times, which cited 2 anonymous sources familiar with internal discussions, it was exactly that kind of public defiance, the dancing, the shrugging off of American threats, that helped convince members of Trump's inner circle that Maduro believed the entire military buildup was a bluff. And that conviction, more than any single provocation, is reportedly what pushed the operation from a contingency plan into a green light. Trump left Washington for the holidays on December 19th, setting up a temporary command post at Mar-a-Lago. Sometime before Christmas, the exact date still isn't public, he gave his approval for the operation to proceed. It almost happened over the holidays themselves. Officials later said there were attempts to launch the raid on both Christmas and New Year's Day, banking on lower security during the celebrations. Both times, the weather over the Caribbean turned against them, forcing the aircraft that would need to escort the mission to turn back before ever crossing into Venezuelan airspace. So they waited. And on New Year's Eve, dressed in a tuxedo at a party at his own home, when a reporter asked Trump what his resolution was for 2026, he answered simply, "Peace on Earth." 3 days later, the skies over Caracas finally cleared. At 10:46 p.m. Eastern Time on January 2nd, from a secure line at Mar-a-Lago, President Trump sent a short message to the commanders waiting on the other end. Good luck and Godspeed. The operation had a name, Absolute Resolve. So secret was the plan that even most of the Pentagon didn't know the precise timing until the night before. Vice President J.D. Vance had spent part of that Friday at Trump's golf club in West Palm Beach, discussing the coming strikes in person, but he left before the operation began, specifically so that a late-night motorcade pulling away from the club wouldn't tip anyone off that something was happening. Congress, too, would not be told until American aircraft were already in the air. Trump later said bluntly that he didn't want lawmakers leaking the details before the mission was complete. Hours earlier, almost without anyone noticing, the Federal Aviation Administration had quietly banned U.S. commercial flights from Venezuelan airspace, citing vague, ongoing military activity. It was the first thread anyone on the outside could have pulled to guess something enormous was coming. Almost nobody pulled it. Then, in the darkest hours of the morning, the sky over Caracas opened up. More than 150 aircraft launched from roughly 20 different bases on land and at sea, fighters, bombers, refueling tankers, reconnaissance planes, all converging on a single stretch of Venezuelan coastline. F-22s, F-35s, F-A-18s, electronic warfare jets, B-1 bombers, and swarms of drones filled the sky above the assault force. Space Command and Cyber Command worked in tandem with the aircraft to blind Venezuela's air defense network before the helicopters ever crossed the coastline. Somewhere in that mix, according to later reporting, the U.S. had also cut electricity to sections of Caracas, a blackout meant to buy the incoming force every possible second of confusion and darkness. At around 2 a.m. local time, residents across Caracas were jolted awake by the first blasts. Witnesses described at least 7 explosions in rapid succession, low-flying aircraft roaring overhead, and columns of black smoke rising into the night sky. 2 of Venezuela's most important military sites, La Carlota Air Base in the heart of the capital, and Fort Tiuna, the largest army base in the entire country, were both hit hard. A journalist living near La Carlota later described waking to explosions, watching fires break out on the runway, and hearing detonations and low aircraft passes continue for nearly an hour. Power went out across parts of southern Caracas. For a moment, an entire city simply didn't know what was happening to it. 600 miles away, President Trump spent much of that night at his own home, watching it all unfold. A photograph the White House later released shows him seated at a table, fingers interlocked, no tie, staring intently at something just out of frame, presumably a live video feed of the raid. Secretary of State Marco Rubio stood at his left shoulder. CIA Director John Ratcliffe stood at his right. None of them said much, according to people in the room. There was nothing left to do but watch. And at the front of the helicopter formation now crossing into that chaos, flying lead, in the cockpit of the very first aircraft, was Chief Warrant Officer 5 Eric Slover, piloting a heavily modified MH-47 Chinook. His job was to get the assault force into the capital alive. That meant threading a formation of helicopters through a narrow, mountainous valley at night, at roughly 100 feet above the water, in weather that was still only marginal, all while enemy surface-to-air threats sat somewhere in the dark below him. According to his official Medal of Honor citation, Slover navigated all of it, the terrain, the weather, the layered air defenses, and brought his aircraft down exactly where it needed to be. The compound inside Fort Tiuna where Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores, were staying. The moment his Chinook touched down, everything went wrong at once. Multiple enemy machine gun positions opened fire at close range. 15 armor-piercing rounds tore into the cockpit. 4 of them hit Slover directly, shredding through his leg and hip. By every account from the men who were there that night, it should have ended the mission. It didn't. Wounded and bleeding, Slover held onto the controls. He kept the aircraft steady in the middle of the kill zone long enough for the assault force, Delta Force operators alongside federal law enforcement agents, there to execute an actual U.S. arrest warrant to get off the helicopter and move on the compound. And even after his troops had disembarked, even as he was still absorbing gunfire, Slover didn't disengage. He identified exactly where the heaviest enemy machine gun positions were, then maneuvered his damaged aircraft so his door gunner could bring fire directly onto those positions and take them out. Inside the compound, the raid unfolded in a matter of minutes. Maduro reportedly tried to make a run for a fortified steel safe room but didn't reach it in time. He and Cilia Flores were seized, completely by surprise, according to General Kane. A firefight broke out as the extraction began, and at least one American helicopter took fire. No Americans were killed that night, but 7 U.S. service members, including Slover, were wounded. Around the leader's residence, the fighting was fierce. Venezuelan officials would later say that a large portion of Maduro's own personal security detail didn't survive the raid, among them members of a Cuban security contingent that had reportedly been assigned to protect him personally. While the assault force was still inside Fort Tiuna, the rest of Caracas was waking up to a nightmare it didn't understand. Interior Minister Diosdado Cabello appeared on state television standing in the street, wearing a helmet and a flak jacket, urging Venezuelans not to cooperate with what he called the terrorist enemy. Defense Minister Vladimir Pedrino Lopez went further, calling it the greatest outrage the country has suffered and announcing a, quote, massive deployment of Venezuela's armed forces in response. Maduro's own government, in a statement issued in his name before his capture was confirmed, declared a state of emergency and accused Washington of an extremely serious military aggression against Venezuelan territory and its people. But the streets told a different story than the statements did. Reuters witnesses described Caracas at dawn as largely empty, checkpoints manned by armed, uniformed men near the Miraflores presidential palace, and otherwise, silence. Most residents simply stayed inside, glued to their phones, some stocking up on groceries in case they needed to wait things out. I couldn't believe it, one Caracas resident later told a reporter. I saw it first on social media and then on television. Now, I want to know what will come next. For supporters of the opposition, led by Nobel Peace Prize laureate Maria Corina Machado, who had spent years campaigning against Maduro's government, there was a very different emotion in the air that morning, something close to disbelief and something close to celebration. Machado herself would post within hours that the hour of freedom had finally arrived for Venezuela. By 3:30 a.m. Eastern Time, U.S. forces were safely out of the country. Maduro's helicopter and Slover's, badly damaged but still flying, returned to the amphibious assault ship USS Iwo Jima waiting offshore. Crew members aboard that flight would later describe Slover as bleeding out badly enough that the soldiers seated behind him could see it, and still refusing to release the controls. He held on, by every account, until another set of hands was physically on the stick in his place. Only then did he allow himself to go still. Less than an hour later, Trump broke the news to the world himself on social media. The United States had carried out a large-scale strike against Venezuela, and its president had been captured and flown out of the country. A photo the White House released later that morning showed Maduro aboard the Iwo Jima in a plain sweatsuit, handcuffed and blindfolded, a jarring image of a man who, hours earlier, had commanded one of the largest militaries in Latin America. In the days that followed, the human toll of the operation came into fuller view. Venezuela's defense ministry eventually revised its casualty count upward to 83 people killed in the raid, including 47 members of Venezuela's own armed forces and 32 Cuban soldiers who had reportedly been stationed in the country to help guard Maduro. More than 110 additional people were reported wounded. Pedrino Lopez held a solemn ceremony to honor the Venezuelan dead and announced plans for a permanent memorial. The full scope of civilian casualties, if any, was still being assessed weeks later. The world reacted almost as fast as Caracas did, and it split cleanly down familiar lines. Russia, China, Iran, and Cuba condemned the operation outright as an act of aggression and a violation of Venezuela's sovereignty. Brazil's Lula da Silva called it a serious affront that crossed an unacceptable line. Colombia's Gustavo Petro rejected the strikes and moved troops to the Venezuelan border to brace for a possible wave of refugees, while separately calling for an emergency United Nations Security Council session, a request Russia and China backed. The UN Secretary-General's office said it was deeply alarmed by a move it warned set a dangerous precedent. On the other side of the ledger, several governments in the hemisphere welcomed the outcome. Ecuador's president said his country valued anything that helped Venezuelans recover democratic institutions and rule of law. Guyana's president called it a validation of shared commitments to freedom, democracy, and regional security. Most NATO governments, along with most of Washington's traditional allies, said simply that they were monitoring the situation closely. Nicolas Maduro, once one of the most talked about men on the planet, was, within the span of a single morning, no longer the one deciding what happened next in his own country. For Eric Slover, though, the operation itself was over the moment his aircraft cleared Venezuelan airspace. He had done exactly what the mission required of him, and paid for it in blood. What came next wasn't combat. It was recovery, headlines, and a country trying to decide what Maduro's absence actually meant. By that same afternoon, Nicolas Maduro was already inside the United States. He and Celia Flores were flown into Stewart International Airport in New York, then transported into federal custody to face the narco-terrorism charges the Justice Department had been building against him for years. He appeared in a Manhattan federal courtroom in the days that followed, a stunning reversal for a man who had ruled Venezuela for more than a decade. Back in Caracas, the government didn't collapse. It simply changed hands. Under Venezuela's own constitutional line of succession, Vice President Delcy Rodriguez, a longtime Maduro loyalist who had overseen much of the country's oil economy and its intelligence services, was sworn in as interim president. In her first public remarks, Rodriguez called the raid an atrocity and insisted Maduro remained Venezuela's only legitimate president. Within days, though, her government made a decision nobody expected. It began releasing political prisoners. The first release came on January 8th, described by officials as a unilateral gesture toward national reconciliation. Among the very first to walk free was Rocio San Miguel, a prominent human rights advocate whose arrest 2 years earlier had drawn international condemnation. It started small. Just 7 or 8 people confirmed freed in the first days. But it kept going. By the end of January, human rights group Foro Penal had confirmed over 260 political prisoners released. By March, the Rodriguez government was claiming more than 600 releases, even as independent monitors could only verify roughly half that number. Still, for a country that had held more than 800 political prisoners under Maduro, detained during years of crackdowns that had drawn a formal international criminal court investigation into crimes against humanity, even a partial, uneven release was something Venezuela hadn't seen in over a decade. Trump himself took credit for it publicly, writing that Venezuela had begun freeing prisoners in a big way because of the American operation. Freedom of the press told a similarly complicated but genuinely improving story. In the first chaotic days after the raid, more than a dozen journalists, many working for international outlets, were briefly detained while covering the aftermath, and several foreign correspondents were turned away at the border entirely. Press freedom groups rightly pointed out that old habits die hard, but the trend over the following months bent unmistakably in one direction. State-run channels like Venevision and Televen, networks that had spent years as mouthpieces of what critics called Chavista media hegemony, began airing something almost unthinkable a year earlier. Interviews and statements from exiled opposition figures like Maria Corina Machado, coverage of political prisoners' complaints, and footage of opposition protests, broadcast on national airwaves without being cut. It's worth remembering just how far down the starting line was. Between 2013 and 2025, more than 60 Venezuelan newspapers had gone out of circulation entirely, and roughly 200 radio stations had lost their broadcast licenses under a policy critics openly called media hegemony, a legacy of the Chavez era that Maduro's government had continued and in many ways sharpened. Hundreds of Venezuelan journalists had gone into exile just to keep reporting at all. Against that backdrop, state television airing an opposition leader's voice, even briefly, even imperfectly, was not a small thing. It was a crack of light in a room that had been sealed for the better part of 2 decades. Nobody serious claimed Venezuela had become a free press overnight, or that its prisons had emptied. Human rights organizations kept careful, sober count of everyone who remained locked up, and outlets kept documenting the radio stations and news sites that stayed shuttered or blocked. But the direction of travel was real, and it was new. For the first time in a generation, dissent in Venezuela was being spoken, broadcast, and printed a little more openly under a government now operating in the long shadow and under the watchful eye of Washington. As one Latin America scholar put it in the days after the raid, Maduro's removal had created a rare transitional moment for a country that hadn't had one in a very long time. Rodriguez's government also opened exploratory diplomatic talks with Washington aimed at restoring the ties Venezuela had severed back in 2019. By March, those talks had produced results. The United States and Venezuela formally agreed to re-establish diplomatic relations, with American officials visiting Caracas to assess reopening the U.S. Embassy, and senior cabinet secretaries touring Venezuela's oil and mining sectors in the following months. Trump, for his part, made no secret of his broader ambitions. In the days after the raid, he told reporters the U.S. wasn't simply leaving Venezuela to sort itself out, it intended to help run the country, in his words, until a proper transition could take place, framing it as a modern update to the 2-century-old Monroe Doctrine. He even gave it a nickname of his own, the Monroe Doctrine. The immediate human cost of the operation, though, belonged to men like Eric Slover, and the story of what happened to him afterward was only beginning. 7 weeks after the raid, on February 24, 2026, Eric Slover walked into the United States Capitol for President Trump's State of the Union address. Or rather, he didn't quite walk. Still recovering from the wounds to his leg and hip, Slover made his way into the House gallery leaning on a walker, his wife Amy at his side. When Slover and Amy entered the chamber, the room rose to its feet. Lawmakers from both parties, a rare moment of total unity in that building, broke into chants of USA, USA, USA. Near the close of his address, Trump turned to tell the country what had really happened that night in Caracas. He described Slover as the man who planned the mission and flew lead in the first helicopter. A big, beautiful, powerful helicopter, Trump called it, carrying dozens of American warfighters into hostile territory. And then he added a detail that would end up defining the story for millions of people watching at home. Before Slover ever left for that mission, his wife Amy had blessed his dog tags with holy water. She knew, Trump said, that this one was going to be rough. Trump walked the country through what happened next, the machine gun fire from every direction as the Chinook came into land, the 4 rounds that tore through Slover's leg and hip, one after another. He absorbed 4 agonizing shots, Trump said, shredding his leg into numerous pieces. And yet, Trump told the chamber, the success of the entire mission, and the lives of everyone on board, had ultimately come down to one thing: Eric Slover's ability to absorb that pain and keep flying. Lieutenant General Jonathan Braga, commander of Joint Special Operations Command, stepped forward and placed the Medal of Honor around Slover's neck, right there in the Capitol gallery. The first time in American history a Medal of Honor had ever been presented during a State of the Union address. "Thank you both," Trump told Slover and his wife, still visibly moved. "It's an honor to be in the same room with you." Slover's official Medal of Honor citation credits him with heroic actions that undoubtedly saved countless American lives and secured the complete and overwhelming success of the mission, language reserved for the rarest acts of valor in American military history. He became the first Chief Warrant Officer 5 ever to receive the Medal of Honor. Alongside the Medal of Honor, Slover's decorations include the Distinguished Flying Cross with V device, the Purple Heart, the Bronze Star with 1 oak leaf cluster, the Meritorious Service Medal with 1 oak leaf cluster, the Air Medal with C device, the Air Medal with numeral 3, the Army Commendation Medal with 1 oak leaf cluster, the Army Achievement Medal with 3 oak leaf clusters, the Combat Action Badge, the Senior Army Aviator Badge, the Master Aviator Badge, the Parachutist Badge, the Air Assault Badge, and the Army Service Ribbon. 10 other American service members who took part in Operation Absolute Resolve were later honored in a separate, private ceremony at the White House. But it was Eric Slover, the enlisted kid from 2005 who became a Chinook pilot, who once flew home from Afghanistan with an unexploded rocket-propelled grenade still lodged in his aircraft, who spent his off-duty years building his body in gyms most people never associated with the word hero, who stood in that gallery on a walker, Medal of Honor around his neck, his wife beside him, having flown directly into gunfire so that everyone behind him could make it out alive. He is, by every account, still recovering. And the country that watched him receive that medal now knows exactly what it cost him.